Pico della Mirandola. Who was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola? Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Count of Concordia, was born February 24th, 1463, in Mirandola, in the region of Ferrara, in Italy. His somewhat adoring, somewhat critical nephew wrote in a biography of his uncle about how a portent, a fiery garland, had mysteriously appeared over the head of his mother, Julia, as she was giving birth to Pico, meaning that the baby would become famous around the world and would harbor an intellectual and spiritual fire that sent him heavenwards. This biography was translated into English by Thomas More not long after. Pico, a handsome young man with piercing green eyes, beautiful red-brown hair, and curiosity that could not be tamed, learned like lightning. His memory was astounding. He could recite Dante's Divine Comedy backward, starting with the last line of the third volume. He was homeschooled at first, then sent off at 14 years old by his hopeful mother, Julia, to study canon law and become a lawyer, or so she thought. Enrolled in the famous University of Bologna, Pico found himself bored. There was absolutely no creativity required, so, not sufficiently challenged, he dropped out, but not before writing an authoritative treatise and summary of the decrees he'd been told to memorize. Ha! Showed them. He moved on to study the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in the original Greek, at Padua, visited Paris, and went to Florence to learn Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. In Florence, he met and became lifelong friends with Marsilio Ficino, a famous philosopher whose love was the works of Plato, not Aristotle. He also encountered the young scholar and humanist Angelo Poliziano, whose lover he seems to have been. Although Pico seems to have been at least bisexual, at one point he scandalously got into a love affair with the wife of a Medici cousin, attempted to run off with her, and was wounded and imprisoned by her husband and had to be rescued by Lorenzo de' Medici himself. For young Pico, there were no walls separating the sages of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and pagan antiquity. They existed side by side. Pico was entranced by symbols, by foreign languages, and by books that talked about magic and numerology. Tutored by a rabbi in Florence, Rabbi Johannan Alemanno, Pico not only studied the Hebrew language, but even became the first Christian scholar to seriously learn and publish treatises about Kabbalah, the ancient Jewish tradition of mystical interpretation of the Bible through the use of extremely complicated systems of numerology. Pico was entranced. He saw symbolism and meaning everywhere. He didn't hesitate to use his language abilities and his access to translators — he actually read most of his texts in Latin — to learn about world religions, philosophy, science, and magic. He wanted to bring Aristotle's systematizing and Plato's emphasis on love and the soul together with Christian, Jewish, Muslim, pagan, scientific, and magical traditions to explain how all the religions of the world could be brought together in harmony, concordia, to explain the system of the universe. At the age of 23, he published and proposed to defend against all comers 900 theses on religion, philosophy, natural philosophy, and magic. This was a book full of 900 different conclusions and true statements about the universe that he had drawn from an enormous number of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic writers, together with a certain Abdullah, the famous Zoroaster, the fictitious but at the time believed real Egyptian philosopher Hermes Trismegistus, various Babylonians and Chaldaean philosophers, and various magical treatises. Pico remixed them all in his own inimitable style so that they agreed with one another. He offered to pay for travel to Rome for any and all scholars in Italy who wanted to discuss and debate his theses with him in public. Pico had his book of theses published and copied many times over, ready to go. His plan was to present the theses in public at Rome On January 6, 1487, the Epiphany, he would give an opening speech explaining the various groups of theses, which he also published in many copies, an oration on man's position in the universe, or as it came to be known afterwards, oration on the dignity of man. The speech starts from the idea that humans, as opposed to animals or angels, are chosen by God to be the only creatures who can choose their own destiny. They can become angels if they wish. This speech, which Pico never actually got a chance to deliver, became for a time a sort of anthem of the Renaissance, and it is what we are reading part of this week. Pico's hopes for his presentation were dashed. Pope Innocent VIII immediately declared at least 13 of the statements heretical and banned Pico's book, copies of which were publicly burned. It was the first printed book to be universally banned by the Church. Pico immediately issued a defense of his theses in print. How could the Church think that these were heretical? This did not change the Pope's mind, and so Pico fled from Rome to France, where he was arrested by Church authorities and held in prison for months. Pico was eventually bailed out and brought back to Florence by his powerful friend, Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, head of the Medici banking family in Florence, known for their patronage of artists and scholars. Pico went into a sort of semi-retirement. He was always attracted to holiness and Christian asceticism, and was in fact a long-time friend of Girolamo Savonarola, at that time just a young monk, but one who would go on to become an extreme religious firebrand and be responsible for the famous Bonfire of the Vanities in Florence on February 7, 1497, in which so many books, paintings, sculptures, and art were gathered up and burned in the public square by fundamentalist supporters of Savonarola. But Pico never took back his syncretic vision. In fact, he worked on even more syncretic writings, including an intense symbolic and magical exposition of the Bible book of Genesis. He also studied more Plato, and dedicated to his dear friend, and it seems lover, Poliziano, a treatise on Plato. In Florence, Pico could now hang out with a group around Ficino, the Platonic Academy, that met occasionally as a group of friends in the hills around Florence, and in a special villa donated to them by Lorenzo the Magnificent. Pico was absolved from the charge of heresy by Pope Alexander VI, the first Borgia Pope, in 1492. Pico was only 31 when he died mysteriously, poisoned by arsenic together with his friend and lover Poliziano. The poison took days to work, and Pico was in agony. So beloved and famous was he that even King Charles VIII, who was on his way to attack and capture the city of Florence, sent ahead a physician to try to help save the life of Pico. His friend and fellow academy teacher Marsilio Ficino wrote, "Our dear Pico left us on the same day that Charles VIII was entering Florence, and Florence might perhaps have never seen a more somber day than that which extinguished Mirandola's light." The suspicion at the time was that the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, known as Piero the Unfortunate, and the heir of Lorenzo, thought that both men were dangerous. Piero might also just have disliked his humanist, somewhat religiously agnostic humanities tutor Poliziano, and been alarmed at the unrepentant heresies of Pico. We may never know the reason, but the 31-year-old Pico left an impressive legacy, even though he was never able to bring about the harmony, the concordia, between all the religious and philosophical systems that he wished to see. Even with the limitations of his time and place, the dream of bringing all the religious and life philosophies together still has a lot of power and attraction for our divided world now.